My name is Kurt Johnson. I'm one of the librarians with the Relic Center for Local History and Genealogy at the Prince William Public Library. We're located at the Central Library on Mathis Avenue, just right in the Manassas area. I'm really pleased to present this program tonight. First off, I have a fantastic promotional video that I'm going to share with all of you. This video is just a minute long, and it does a great job of setting the stage for what we're about to learn today. So without further ado, I'm going to share this fantastic video.
Never in a million years did I think research that I participated in and conducted as a sophomore in college would lead to anything major.
The Enslaved People of George Mason Memorial Project was a student-driven research opportunity exploring the lives of men, women, and children enslaved at Gunston Hall.
How do you tell the story of someone who was forgotten by history when you have essentially no pieces of the story?
The goal of our project really was to return the humanity of the people that George Mason enslaved to them.
The university is where these conversations should be happening. It's part of our complicated legacy.
The memorial is going to be in the center of our campus, and we'll finally be able to give credit where it's due.
Inevitably, our history is tied to George Mason, the man. While we continue to celebrate him, and we should be celebrating him, we can't forget the people and the individuals that gave him the ability to do incredible things that he did.
Okay, that just gives me chills as a George Mason graduate myself. That's fantastic. So with that out of the way, I'm going to introduce our two presenters and turn it over to them. Wendi Manuel-Scott is a professor of integrative studies and history and associate director of the Center for Mason Legacies. She received a PhD in history from Howard University. Her scholarship and teaching focuses on how the past, such as New Wave slave systems, Jim Crow era segregation, corporal systems of incarceration, patriarchal cultures, and anti-Black racism, shape our modern understanding of freedom and liberatory movements for justice. Both in and outside of the classroom, her approach is to show students that history is relevant to their lives, regardless of their chosen major, professional interests, or future activities. Professor Manuel-Scott led a cohort of Mason students with Professor Benedict Carton, designed to excavate the experiences of the forgotten families enslaved on Mason's Gunston Hall plantation. The 2017 Summer Initiative created opportunities for meaningful conversations about the university's namesake and inspired the construction of a memorial, which we just saw in the video, that will center the humanity of the enslaved people of Gunston Hall. She hopes her work as a public historian makes the unseen seen and the silenced heard. Also tonight, George Oberle is the history librarian and assistant professor in the Department of History and Art History at George Mason. He received his PhD in history from George Mason. His scholarship focuses on the collection and dissemination of knowledge in the early republic and on the legacies of the George Mason and Mason family in the region. He is the director of the newly established Center for Mason Legacies, which is an interdisciplinary and collaborative research center established by the university libraries and the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. That center seeks to preserve and examine the legacy of George Mason IV, the famous George Mason, his ancestors and heirs, and the people he enslaved. They do this by engaging student researchers in studying the past and present influences of our university's namesake through a combination of scholarly research, public history, teaching innovation, and community outreach. And so with that, George and Wendi, please feel free to unmute yourselves, and I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone out in Prince William County. I'm a resident of Loudoun County, so we're next door neighbors. And I'm thrilled to be with you. For many years, I've worked with the Black History Committee out in Loudoun County with the Bosch Library. And so I know the importance of the relationship between faculty at institutions and the community. And I think together we can really do amazing work. And I think this is one of the reasons why George and I are thrilled to share what we have started, right? I really do think it's something that we started at George Mason that has been a community effort. So if you don't mind, I'm going to flip us over to a few slides. And my goal is to go about 15 or so minutes, and then I'll pass the baton to George, and then he'll share some insights with you for about 15 minutes or so. And that will leave us about a half an hour for some Q&A and for some dialogue. Okie dokie? All right. So, all right. Yes. So I want to start with a prompt and just kind of sit for a moment and consider, right, how you might respond to these two questions. Whose stories are represented within the traditional historical narrative? Think the K through 12 textbooks, think SOLs, the standards of learning that our kids might engage, think perhaps a U.S. history course that you had, or maybe perhaps you're in the middle of taking right now, and whose histories are erased, silenced, muted, right? And answers. What comes to mind when you think about these two questions in terms of representation of stories and narratives and the erasure of voices, experiences, even communities? And so these two questions guided our students, and in fact, it was student inquiry, students' questions around who was George Mason, around who were the people he enslaved, that really framed the research that we began 4-ish years ago now. And so before I say a little bit more about the Enslaved People of George Mason project, I want to drill down just a bit on these two questions that I've posed, because I think the framing, right, really helps us better understand the power, the consequential nature of asking those questions. So some of you may be familiar with Toni Morrison. When I was just a wee child, my father assigned Bluest Eye to me. But on my bookshelf, I'm sure I've got at least 5 or 6 of her books. So she's certainly been a part of my kind of intellectual growth. And at one point, Toni Morrison noted, quote, "My job becomes how to rip that veil drawn over proceedings too terrible to relate. This exercise is also critical for any person who is Black or who belongs to any marginalized category. For historically, we are seldom invited to participate in the discourse, even when we are its topic." And so here we have Toni Morrison telling us about how important it is to tell the stories that haven't been told, to make heard the voices that have been silent, and to reconstruct those histories that have been erased. And you heard one of our students in the video note that what does it mean to tell the stories that can't be told, to tell the stories that rip at our heart. And this was also a part of so much of Toni Morrison's work as an incredible writer. But it is also the work of archivists, of scholars, of students, of community members. How do we tell the stories that are too hard, too terrible, too painful to tell? And we have to figure out a way to do that, because as I have noted on the bottom of this slide, what we cannot see, cannot remember, right, is a part of that dominating history that erases the marginalized, be they immigrants, indigenous people, people of African descent, women, poor folk, right? So if we cannot see and cannot remember, right, those stories that are part of the dominating history project, then we continue to maintain that erasure. And so at George Mason University, faculty and students and even administrators, we understand the value of telling those difficult stories. I want to share one other. This is the professor in me, so forgive me. But I want to give you one other, right, historian or a historian to also help us think about the significance of the project that we've started at George Mason, and even to think about the work that Dr. George Oberle is going to share with you in a moment. One of my favorite historians, her name is Sadia Hartman. She's an incredible scholar. And if you haven't picked up Lose Your Mother, it's a very readable text. I assign it to students in one of my courses. And I'll just read this one sentence to you, so follow along with me. One of the things I think is true, which is a way of thinking about the afterlife of slavery in regard to how we inhabit historical time, in the sense of temporal entanglement, where the past, the present, and the future are not discrete and cut off from one another, but rather that we live in the simultaneity of that entanglement. Oh my gosh, Hartman drops the mic on us here, right? What does it mean for us to understand this simultaneity of this temporal entanglement? Meaning that when we make seen and heard those voices of the past, we are also changing how we inhabit the present and then how we imagine the future. Right? So the past, the present, and the future are with us in this moment, which is why the work that the Prince William archivist and community members are doing, the work that you are doing, why it matters. It's why the work that we are doing at George Mason University through the Enslaved People of George Mason Project matters. It's why Dr. Oberle's work, his careful work in the Fairfax County Courthouse and in George Mason's papers, that is why it matters. So we are left then to say, well, how do we do this? How do we tell the stories that are too hard to tell, to hold? Right? How do we care for those that have been traditionally deemed unworthy of remembering? How do we do that work right now in 2021? How do we do that work? If you are a school teacher, how do you do that work? How do we help young people learn how to care for those deemed unworthy of remembering from the past? How do we help our children, right, care for those deemed unworthy of remembering? And so at George Mason University, we believe that one way that we can contribute to this work is through a reimagination of the very center of our campus. We made an intentional decision not to remove the George Mason statue. George can tell you a bit about the genesis of the statue and how long it's existed on our Fairfax campus. But what we did choose to do is to create a new base. And in that base of the George Mason statue, it will include 4 excerpts from writings by George Mason IV. And I'm not going to spend too much time on 3 of them, but one of them, in his last will and testament, really helped to shape the memorial that we created. And you'll note I have just 3 words highlighted. And these 3 words, when we read them and then just kind of held the moment, we all had light bulbs going off because we realized the power of the words. What we learned from this excerpt from George Mason IV's last will and testament, we learned what he valued, what he thought was worthy of giving, bequeathing to his children. And what he thought was most valuable to bequeath to his children were the bodies of enslaved children, boys and girls, men and women. And not only did he determine that he wanted to bequeath the bodies, but also the literal wounds of girls and women. Note, the following slaves with their increase, meaning with the children that they would one day give life to. And those children would exist in perpetual and inheritable servitude themselves. And so, statement, along with his identification of a Negro girl named Penny to his young daughter Anne, really helped to frame, organize the way that we would design the memorial. And so there are multiple features of the memorial. I won't kind of go through all of the elements, but one of the essential elements of the memorial are these two panels. They're actually in the process of fabricating them right now. And one panel to James, who was an enslaved manservant of George Mason and followed and traveled with George Mason extensively, because we know George Mason IV suffered from gout and other physical ailments. There is some evidence to suggest he may have even had to carry George Mason IV down and up the stairs, bring his ink and his quill to him, right? And then the other individual is Penny. Penny is that young girl that's identified in George Mason's last will and testament. And that's why I just want to share a few things with you. As we were making very careful decisions with the designers, we were looking at the fabrication, the way in which the letters would look, the depth of the panels that would be installed here in the center of campus. This was probably taken 2 years ago now, I think. Our colleague, Dr. Benedict Carton, holding them up for us to kind of consider which one is best, looking at the depth of the engravings. But Penny. So on the Penny panel, the names of all of the enslaved children held at Gunston Hall and noted in the will and testament, they are engraved on this Penny panel. That was very intentional on our part. Again, thinking about how do we honor those who have not been deemed worth remembering? How do we tell the stories that we don't even have the full archival evidence to tell those stories? We can start with saying their names. In addition, we also included a bit of historical context for all students and visitors who come to the center of our campus, so they have a bit of information about Penny. But I want to draw your attention to the actual kind of design of the panel. You'll see that we asked guests to look through the Penny panel, and through the panel they can see George Mason. What we are suggesting here is that we can certainly look at George Mason, the patriot, the man who penned the Virginia Declaration of Rights, right? But we can also look at George Mason through the eyes of little enslaved Penny. Change our vantage point, change the position, the way in which we view George Mason IV, to complicate how we understand George Mason IV. In addition, we also wanted to provide a way for folks to understand how she experienced enslavement in Gunston Hall. And so if you've ever gone to Gunston Hall, you will know there is this main large staircase for the Mason family, for the dignitaries that visited the Mason family. But then right off to the left, there is this narrow winding staircase. And that is the staircase that little Penny and other enslaved people, right, they would have traveled up and down that staircase, wee hours of the night, at the beck and call of the Mason children, of the Mason family. And so you'll note here that detail. We see Penny climbing the stairs with the serving set. And in addition, we also have our hand up. It's a bit hard to tell here because we want to remind all of our students and potential students, right, that enslaved people found ingenious and incredibly unique ways to resist their enslavement, to resist this structure that sought to dehumanize them. So there was resistance, sometimes resistance including running away, and we have evidence of enslaved people running away from Gunston Hall because George Mason placed ads in the local papers. But we also know people had to find more covert, less obvious ways to resist. And so when we shared the renderings of the memorial to our campus community, students and faculty and administrators were all blown away, understanding the gravity of how this memorial would literally change how we see ourselves. And one student, one wet fall morning, passed the George Mason statue, pulled out her notebook, scribbled a note to George Mason IV, ripped it out of her notebook, and laid it at George Mason's feet, the feet that most often students rub for good luck. And there she wrote, "Dear George, I will take the degree, education you did not want Penny to have, Melissa." And so the memorial is not even there. And yet we can see the impact of telling the story that can't be told, of remembering those the traditional narrative has deemed unworthy of remembering, and that our students from all walks of life, from all across the globe, right, they see themselves in this new narrative, in this more complicated, fuller version, right, of who we are as a nation and who we are as an institution. And that's it.
Great. So now I got to follow that, right? No, that's awesome. I'm stunned by that image, and I remember the day that when the person who was kind of guiding the architectural project found it at the foot of George Mason's statue. And shared it with us, and we were just all excited, and because we knew that, oh, maybe people are seeing this and it's making a difference. So thank you, Wendi. And thank you for bringing that memory back, because it was an incredibly powerful memory for me. So let me just share a little bit of my part of this presentation, and I'm going to do a combination of sharing some PowerPoint slides, but also showing some mock-ups of some work that we're doing in the new Center for Mason Legacies, which actually came as a direct result of the work that we were doing as part of the Enslaved Children of George Mason project. So my main gig is as a librarian. Whoops, let's see. Hold on, it just shifted screens on me here. Bear with me a second. Let me put you over here. So can you see my slides now? Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so my main gig is as a librarian, but I'm also now half-time as a professor in the Department of History and Art History. And when I was working with Ben and Wendi on this project, they asked me to join because of my my expertise in sources, my expertise in working on folks like the founders. I mean, I do a lot of work on the early republic. I knew quite a lot about the papers of George Mason. And in fact, several students had come to me in recent years asking for help finding information on how can they engage with their questions about the enslaved population of George Mason. And there's a pretty major collection that was done, a 3-volume set that was finished around 1971 or so, where by a famous a documentary editor type of guy. And so obviously I went to those papers first, and the first thing I did is look in the index because that's what we do, right? And I looked for the word slaves, and guess what? Nothing. Not a single entry on slaves. There was something on slavery, comma, opposition to it, because famously George Mason opposed the transatlantic slave trade. But there was nothing about the enslaved people. So then I had to start getting a little more clever about things. I found, oh, there is, you just have to look it up really differently, because the guy who edited the papers didn't think about the enslaved population as being important enough to index in that particular set of papers, which then led us to start going back to other sources, like at the Fairfax County Courthouse. So, long story short, we started finding a lot of stuff that was left out of those papers, lots of stuff. And I'm very proud of one of the GRAs who works with us. And before I go too much further, Tony Guidone, who has tirelessly sought out the names of enslaved people. And we went from having a list, thanks to Patricia Dunn's, Terry Dunn's work, of approximately 70 some enslaved people. I might be getting that wrong, but we now have the names of over 100 and some enslaved people that we have identified because of Tony's work by name. And so that's a real blessing, and we appreciate his hard work. So what does the Center for Mason Legacies do? Well, as Wendi and Ben and I were talking, we said, wouldn't it be great if we had this ongoing project that explored local history to try to uncover these very stories that Wendi was just talking about? And in the midst of like just, noodling around, kind of like jazz noodling, right? We're just noodling around in the archives. We found incredible stories of this person, Hannah Burke, who was a free Black woman who over time, because she was accused of having an unruly house, was eventually enslaved, re-enslaved. And we were finding all these little pieces of stories. And so one of the first things I said I could do, and I talked with Ben and Wendi carefully about this, is I said, well, maybe I can change what I teach about. And because I am, as my main gig as the history librarian, is they paired me up and started having me teach History 300, which is our introduction to methods, and also our History Capstone, which is our History 499 class. And in fact, here's some pictures of some of our people, our students in action before the COVID situation shut down the archives. This happens to be a picture of an honors class. So I got to work with multidisciplinary folks who brought their own set of questions to topics. And my main job was just to teach them how historians thought about stuff. And it was fantastic because they got to explore the archives and look at local history topics. In this case, this was at our special collections at George Mason. But I also took them to the local archive up in the Fairfax County Public Library. Here's an example of one of my 499 classes. So this is the senior capstone classes. Here's another picture from that group, I believe. In fact, I believe one of the attendees is here tonight. I won't point her out, but she did a great paper. What's that?
I don't see the photos you're showing.
Oh, you don't? Oh, no.
I'm just looking at the scope and contents page.
Oh, no. Okay, pardon. Hold on. Let's see what's going on.
Yes, I was just getting some comments and I wasn't quite sure. Yes, I don't think any of us are seeing them, George.
Oh, that's really annoying. Hold on.
So if you under the share content, it gives you different options.
Yep. So it's switching me around to different screens. I'm sorry, guys.
Now you're on your PowerPoint.
Not a problem. I had the same problem when I was introducing you guys. But.
Sorry. Hold on. Let's see how this works. Yep, it's shifting me back, but hold on. I know what I'll do. Haha. Let's try it this way. Sorry, everyone. All right. let's do this. How's that?
That's yeah, that's the picture.
Okay.
Yes.
Great.
Sure.
So this is an example. And students in action in that archival work. And here is the student who's here tonight. She did a great paper on the Manassas Industrial School right there in Prince William County. So I won't point her out though, because embarrass her. But what we started to do is we started to put a lot of the research that students are doing, their preliminary research, up on Omeka sites. And we specifically, let me go to a live version of this. Specifically, we had them work on, or I have them do essentially a mini exhibit instead of a major paper. And in this exhibit, they can present their story, a kind of interesting introduction to a local history story. And they can do that through the evidence that they're finding in the archives. And so I'm actually going to go to some of the more recent ones, which are on the later pages. I'm going to show this one because I was just blown away. This was last semester in the middle of all the COVID stuff. So this person was still able to get out into the archives a little and explore this Children of the Confederacy chapter of the Daughters of the Confederacy project. And in this project, she found, or in this, this group, she found this scrapbook that had all this stuff that introduced children to the lost cause narrative, to how to use the terms that they use to learn the catechism of the Confederacy, the Daughters of the Confederacy, the catechism. And it has items like the salute to their Confederate flag, and it has specific creeds that they would then recite. And we went through this and just talked about it as a relatively recent kind of institution. This was going on in the 50s. She gives these nice examples of evidence and she annotates them so that the reader understands the context of why these pieces of evidence matter. And she even brought in things that were still part of the scrapbook, like this image from this 1950 something article in, I forget which newspaper it is, but essentially the Washington Daily News, excuse me. I mean, that is a very incredible image considering what happened just a few weeks ago. And then these letters to the editor about the South rising again, or the Confederacy has risen again, excuse me. So it was a very powerful project, and she showed how this group tied in with textbook creation. And I thought it was a very powerful kind of introduction to this particular issue. And she gave some really fantastic ideas for future research. But that's only one. We had tons of really interesting projects. You know, the ones that are kind of more polished, I've made them public. Many of them are not polished, and as a result, they stay hidden. And it's not that they were bad work, it's just they weren't as ready for prime time. So that's one example of the work that we're doing. Another thing that I really think is important is the Mason Family Account Book project. So the Mason Family Account Book is a manuscript source that the George Mason Special Collections purchased a while back. It's been scanned for many years. We scanned it and it's been available for a long time. These are really beautiful scans, to be honest. I'll just kind of skip ahead because there's a lot of empty pages in it. But it's like any account book from this era. It essentially is a double entry. And so you have the credits and the debits, and it is in manuscript form, which means that it's not really searchable. So as a result, it hasn't really been used as much as it should be. I'm not sure how much you follow some of the latest scholarship that's coming out, but some of the stuff that's really important is really emphasizing the use of account books. So I said, you know what? I think I have an idea, because I heard about this other project being done on the George Washington family papers, and I bet we can do something similar and maybe a little better. So we started to work on the Mason family book. So this is just a prototype. It's not a completely working component, because Dr. Cindy Kerner and myself are co-teaching classes once a year, where we are teaching students how to do documentary editing and to make these sources more available. So there's two parts to this that are kind of working. We have all the account book folios already built in and scanned here. So for an example, this is what ours looks like. So we have account book folio 41, that's just our word for side-by-side pages, right? That's all that folio stuff means. And then below it, we have the students transcribe the content, and that will make it searchable, and you can use it as a data form. But guess what? That's not what's cool. Eventually, what's cool is this part. If you see this, all people with accounts, we are having the students do mini research projects on all these people that are identified in this particular account book. People like Richard Williams. So last year, our first class, I think we called them the Pathfinders. No, we called them the Pioneers. Sometimes we called them the guinea pigs. Anyway, they were our first. So ultimately, this one student did an incredible biography on Richard Williams, who was an enslaved man who worked and dwelt at Stephen Thompson Mason's Raspberry Plain out in Loudon, out in your neck of the woods, Wendi. And he actually was manumitted by Stephen Thompson Mason, one of the few enslaved people that we know of that was freed by one of the Masons. And this comes from Thompson Mason's line. I can more about them later if you're interested. But anyway, Richard is really fascinating because he was manumitted, he was kept on as an overseer and then paid, and then he purchased the freedom of one, maybe two of them. And that's what this entry captures. And we have about 15 done of these, and we intend to keep doing this until we get everybody done that's in the book. And as you can see here, he's represented in several different parts of this account book so that we can actually start to do some analysis to help fill in some gaps. And we've done this one transcription entry associated with him. So that's our account book project, which we're super excited about. The other ongoing project, and this is really a prototype that I'm going to show you here, and I have to show you this first. If you've ever been to the Fairfax County Circuit Court Historic Record Center, you'll recognize these cards. So these cards are the index that is that allows you access to the court order books. So this pencil here is trying to give you scale of all the cards with the Mason family that has the Mason family name is somewhere left here, right? I mean, and there were some, I think these are all George Mason, excuse me. And we have some 2,000 cards that we had to transcribe and then And we then loaded that spreadsheet into this Omeka database. And we've only done part of it because this is just a trial. But in this, we now can actually search quite a lot that particular database or that index by just searching, I don't know, let's just use slaves, right? And so these are the small number of entries. Now, once we get the full thing in there, there'll be bigger results. But these are examples. Slaves are mentioned in those court order books, and it gives the where you go to get it. And these happen to be referencing personal property tax lists. So there's also, you could search it for roads if you wanted to or whatever, right? And eventually we're going to have this built out with exhibits also and a connection to the Mason family tree, because they're so complicated. They keep naming their children all the same names. And so it's hard to keep them all straight, to be honest. So having that family tree will be really useful. And then the last working project that I want to show you is something that our student just worked on over the summer. And this is another Omeka project that was on the Mason statue. Wendi showed you our new enslaved monument to the memorial, excuse me, to the enslaved people. This is a kind of a history of the existing George Mason statue done by a graduate student who really did a nice job of tracing the story of how that statue was built, why it was built, and ultimately, you know, give some ideas for future research. And I love these pictures where we dress up George. He would have hated that, I'm sure, but I love it. But anyway, so it's just been a real work on this. I'm kind of skipping some of these a little bit, but let me just say one more thing about a project that we're working on. It's called Black Lives Next Door. And this is, again, one of these things where we were noodling around in the archive. And I had just read some work, a book called The Color of Law, which looks at how different covenants in neighborhoods had impacted, you know, different, it was a major problem in terms of race. Oh, you got it too. There it is. Awesome. Wendy's got The Color of Law right there. So in this case, this is in the neighborhood of Colchester, which is on the Mason Neck, interestingly enough, right near where George Mason's Gunston Hall is. And notice here in the crossed out, no person of any race other than the white race shall use or occupy any building, any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race, domiciled with an owner or tenant. So, you know, if they were servants living there, it was okay to have them live in, but not if they were owning the house. So anyway, we're starting to actually look and explore at how the relationship between the Black community and George Mason College and George Mason University eventually, as well as the area in Fairfax, what the relationships between these places were. And with that, I'll just kind of stop, and hopefully we can get some questions and have a conversation started.
Rob, both of you, fantastic. That's great. We've got one question already sent in for both of you. Has George Mason University hired a professional genealogist, as some other universities have done, to find descendants of the enslaved people named in the Mason family documents?
We're the closest thing. We kind of do it on in our spare time in a way. So we have been really interested, and actually Tony and I have been trying to think about it in a different way. Instead of tracing things get really messy around around the 1819 time period, and that's when we lose track of some of the enslaved people. I've been working on an art that's tracing that's tracing I've been actually through the women, especially the daughter, and it gets harder to lose. You start to lose exactly who you start to lose them around time. So one thing that Tony and I were thinking about is starting with like a really authoritative list and working our way back. So the authoritative lists might be something like in the 1860 and working with James Murray Mason and many of the others Masons that are still around. But it gets so hard because some of the Masons are moving west. They have property out west. Some of them live here, but they have enslaved people in places like Mississippi. And I mean, we're finding them all over the place. It's really crazy. So I'd love to have the money to be able to do that, though.
George, that's what I was going to pick on and just say, when George and our other colleague, Dr. Benedict Carton, and I sit still for a moment and think about how much work with student support we've been able to do in 4 years. It really is mind-blowing, and it is because of students' passion. I think that we continually are reinvigorated to do this work, but one of our hopes once we have the ribbon cutting of the memorial is that we will be able to identify additional sources of financial support so that we can pay more graduate students and undergraduate students to support us in this work. As George has just noted, this can take us far beyond the boundaries, the geography of Virginia. And so we've even had a woman email us who's in Canada, who seems to think that one of her foreparents, may have been enslaved by George Mason. So this is ongoing work that will require not just the passion, but also the financial support to continue to do that. And obviously our institution has been wonderful, but this is a massive, massive undertaking.
Yeah, and I have one little thing to add on, and I'm sure the people that have done that kind of work, usually that kind of work takes so long to do, and to do it properly and to do it correctly, as many of you know, it's just incredibly time consuming. But we would love to have any support that people would be willing to give. Maybe we can develop partnerships with people too. We're really into trying to work with the community.
Sounds great. We have another question that's been sent in. Where can we read some of these students' projects that were published that you referred to?
Yeah, so you just go to Mason's Legacies .org.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. Any other question?
Yep.
Mason's Legacies. Okay.
And George, does that also include the work from the Enslaved Children Project, or that's a separate site?
Pardon me, it's a separate site. So Enslaved Children is ECGM. Net.
I'll tell you what, George, maybe when after this we can get the email straight, and when I send the link to the video, the recording of this presentation, I can include all those links as well.
Easier. Let's just do it that way.
Okay.
Perfect.
We'll do that. We'll touch base. That should be going out in a day or two, hopefully. It usually doesn't take that much time to get it ready. Any other questions? This was just a fantastic presentation.
I'll add why folks are maybe thinking, because it's another way to kind of get a sense of the type of work that we're doing at Mason, but also how it's connected to other institutions. So some of you may know that there is this larger consortium called Universities Studying Slavery. who started out at UVA with their research around the enslaved people who, I mean, built the physical, right, the infrastructure of UVA, and they've just they did the ribbon cutting on their memorial to the enslaved people that labored at UVA. But they started this larger consortium. You can go online, Universities Studying Slavery, to connect with other institutions like Brown, like Georgetown, like George Mason, College of Charleston, where I went to for undergrad, Harvard, Yale, that are also beginning to ask the uncomfortable questions about whose stories have not been told, and what is the relationship between slavery or Jim Crow systems of segregation and the institutions today. And so you will find that there are lots of symposiums and events that the universities that are part of this consortium host. Lately, many of them have been online, and so they're accessible. They also provide opportunities for community members and students to engage in research regarding, or it has to do with those specific institutions. But I think it also symbolizes kind of where we are, this kind of critical turning point in terms of recognizing the long history of institutions in terms of the traditional narratives, but also the work we have the opportunity to do in terms of complicating those stories that we need to tell.
Yeah. And we just had another.
Yeah, can I quickly just add, one of the things that I think Wendi, Ben, and I just think has been really advantageous for us at George Mason is that we've been able to participate with all of these people who are dealing, in some ways, they're dealing with harder questions, although we legacy of dealing with, you know, the latter part of the Jim, you know, and we have some legacies of our own to deal with in terms of problematic race relations on our campus. But our campus wasn't literally built by the enslaved people, right? And so it kind of freed us up, at least at first, wouldn't you say, Wendi, to kind of start to explore this, and people gave us some room to work.
Absolutely.
And
I mean,
and I don't think that changed our questions. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think it changed our questions. I think it just gave us a chance.
We did have another participant who, this person is a professional genealogist themselves, pointed out that they know how tough this research can be and wondered if perhaps the genealogical community in this area could, you know, contribute time and to these projects. So certainly through LA and the Virginia
Please
room in Fairfax. Yes.
Please.
It's a big yes. Yes.
Yeah, these are great questions, and I think one of the things that the Mason's Legacy Center that George is the director of, we've newly established it, but one of the things that's at the top of our kind of list of to-do is to think about how we can intentionally establish relationships, one with K through 12, but also with community genealogists and lay historians as well. And so whether that is a community fellowship or something, we're still working out the details, but we absolutely want to establish a relationship with our community that is sustainable, and also use the incredible resources and knowledge, right, that so many of our community members have. So stay tuned for that one, I think.
Okay, fantastic.
Yep.
All right. I think we're all caught up with questions, and this has just been fantastic. I want to thank both of you, Dr. Manuel-Scott and Dr. Oberle, for your time. Again, all of you that are viewing this or attended, you can look forward to the video and the other links. And thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And everyone have a wonderful night.
Take care, everyone. It was nice to meet you all.
Yes.
All right, be well, be safe.
Absolutely.